At 0300 hours on March 26, 1945, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood in the darkness of a cave on the northern end of Iwo Jima and listened to something that few Japanese officers would ever hear. Silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of defeat approaching with mathematical certainty. For 36 days, the sound of American naval gunfire had been constant. The roar of flamethrowers. The explosions of grenades and demolition charges. The mechanical grinding of Sherman tanks. Now, in this moment before dawn, there was only the labored breathing of the 400 men who remained alive under his command. Kuribayashi was not a man given to illusions. He had studied in America. He had walked the streets of Detroit and Boston. He had attended Harvard University and the United States Army War College. He knew the industrial might he was facing. Before leaving for Iwo Jima 9 months earlier, he had told his wife that not even his ashes would return home. He had been correct. What Kuribayashi did not know, what he could not have predicted, was how his analysis of the enemy would change in the weeks of fighting. He had expected American firepower. He had planned for American numbers. What he encountered instead was something his training at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy had not prepared him for. He encountered Marines who would not stop. This is the story of how the battle for Iwo Jima shattered Japanese military assumptions about American fighting men. Not because the Americans had better weapons or superior tactics, but because they possessed a quality that Japanese officers, trained in a 1,000-year tradition of warrior discipline, found both incomprehensible and terrifying. The Americans fought with a ferocity that ignored casualties. They advanced when any rational military calculation said they should retreat. They pressed forward through volcanic ash that swallowed men to their knees, through minefields that turned tanks into burning coffins, through artillery fire so precise it had been registered on every square meter of beach during months of preparation. And when Japanese defenders believed they had broken an American unit, when logic said the Marines would withdraw and regroup, fresh waves of men would appear from the smoke carrying more flamethrowers, more explosives, more determination. The Japanese generals who survived Iwo Jima would write about these Marines with something approaching disbelief. Several would write with respect. One would call them the most formidable enemy the Imperial Japanese Army had ever faced. This is their story, told through their words and their actions, of the 36 days when Iwo Jima became a test not of equipment or strategy, but of human will. The Japanese military in 1944 was a force that had conquered much of Asia and the Pacific. Its officers had been trained in a tradition emphasizing discipline, sacrifice, and absolute obedience to the emperor. Japanese forces had taken Singapore in 70 days. They had driven Allied forces from the Philippines. They had established an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But by February 1945, that empire was collapsing. American submarines had strangled Japanese shipping lanes. American bombers were striking the home islands with increasing frequency. The question was no longer whether Japan would lose the war, but how many Americans the Japanese could kill before the inevitable surrender. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, sulfur, and ash. It sat 700 miles from Tokyo, directly in the path of American B-29 bombers flying from bases in the Mariana Islands. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress. They had dug 11 miles of tunnels connecting more than 5,000 caves and pillboxes. They had placed artillery to cover every approach. They had created interlocking fields of fire so complete that no square foot of beach was safe from Japanese guns. If the question of whether you're enjoying this story resonates with you, then consider clicking the like button below and subscribing to this channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had arrived on Iwo Jima on June 8, 1944. What he found appalled him. The garrison had been digging trenches on the beaches, preparing to meet the American invasion with a traditional defense at the water's edge. Kuribayashi immediately ordered them to stop. He had studied American amphibious assaults at Tarawa and Saipan. He knew that naval gunfire would destroy any beach defenses before the first Marines set foot on the island. He made a careful survey of every square meter of Iwo Jima. Then he gave orders that would doom 22,000 men, including himself, but would also inflict casualties on the Americans beyond anything they had experienced in the Pacific War. The defense of Iwo Jima would be fought entirely from underground. Kuribayashi banned the traditional banzai charge. He considered it a waste of his men's lives. Instead, his soldiers would fight from concealed positions. They would let the Marines land unopposed. They would allow thousands of Americans to crowd onto the beaches. Then they would open fire from positions the pre-invasion bombardment had not touched because the positions were invisible from the air and from the sea. By February 19, 1945, when the Marines landed, Iwo Jima had been bombed and shelled for 74 consecutive days. It was the longest pre-invasion bombardment in the Pacific War. The Marines expected the island to be a corpse. They expected minimal resistance. They expected to secure Iwo Jima in 5 days. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, had requested 10 days of heavy naval bombardment immediately before the landing. Rear Admiral William Blandy refused. He insisted on 3 days. Schmidt asked for 9 days. Blandy refused again. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one and cost Marine lives from the first moment they stepped onto Iwo Jima's black volcanic sand. At 0900 hours on February 19th, the first wave of Marines hit the beach. The landing site had been designated Green Beach, Red Beach, Yellow Beach, and Blue Beach, running from south to north along the southeastern shore beneath Mount Suribachi. Private First Class Robert Leader of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, climbed down from his landing craft and immediately sank to his ankles in volcanic ash. The beach rose steeply ahead of him, a 15-foot terrace of loose black sand that shifted and slid with every step. Behind him, more landing craft were hitting the beach. Amtraks carrying troops and equipment struggled inland, their treads spinning uselessly in the ash. Tanks bogged down within meters of the water. For the first hour, there was almost no enemy fire. The Marines pushed inland, confused by the absence of resistance. Some began to think the bombardment had worked better than anyone expected. Others, veterans of previous Pacific campaigns, knew better. They kept moving, kept digging, kept watching the ridges above them. At approximately 1000 hours, Japanese artillery opened fire. The effect was catastrophic. Every gun position on the island had been pre-registered on the beaches. Kuribayashi's artillery commanders knew the range and deflection for every square meter of sand. Mortars began falling with mechanical precision. Heavy artillery from positions in the northern highlands started dropping shells into the crowded beach. Marines who had just landed found themselves trapped between the water and the steep terrace, unable to advance, unable to retreat, forced to dig fighting positions in ash that collapsed as fast as they could shovel it. One Marine later described it as trying to dig a hole in a barrel of wheat. By the end of the first day, 30,000 Marines were ashore. Mount Suribachi had been isolated. Over 500 Marines were dead. The butcher's bill for Iwo Jima had begun. Kuribayashi watched the American landing from his command post near the center of the island. He had expected the Marines to come. He had expected their massive firepower. What he began to notice in those first hours was something that troubled him. The Americans were not stopping. Under artillery fire that should have pinned them to the beaches, they were advancing. Under mortar fire so intense that the volcanic ash was being churned into a black fog, they were moving forward. Tanks that became mired in the ash were abandoned. Marines on foot simply went around them and kept going. By nightfall on February 19th, the Marines had established a foothold across the entire southern end of the island. They had cut off Mount Suribachi from the rest of the Japanese defensive system. They had suffered terrible casualties, but they had not retreated. Kuribayashi sent a message to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. He reported that the American landing was proceeding as expected. He did not mention what he was beginning to suspect. The Marines he was facing were different from the soldiers who had fought elsewhere in the Pacific. These were not men who would break under fire. These were not men who would pause to consolidate their gains. These were men who seemed to accept casualties as simply the price of moving forward. The assault on Mount Suribachi began on February 21st. Suribachi was a 550-foot extinct volcano that dominated the southern end of the island. Japanese artillery observers on its summit could direct fire onto the entire beach area. The mountain was honeycombed with tunnels and gun positions. Its approaches were covered by machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi commanded approximately 1,400 troops defending Suribachi. He had spent months preparing his positions. He had enough ammunition and food to hold out for weeks. He expected the Marines to besiege the mountain, to surround it and starve it out while they secured the rest of the island. Instead, they attacked directly. Companies from the 28th Marines began advancing on Suribachi at 0830 hours. They moved through minefields. They crawled through fields of fire so concentrated that vegetation was stripped from the slopes by bullets. They used flamethrowers to burn Japanese soldiers out of caves. They used demolition charges to seal bunkers. They took casualties that would have broken most units and kept moving forward. Private First Class Donald Rule of Easy Company, 28th Marines, was moving with his squad when a grenade landed among them. Rule threw himself on the grenade. It exploded, killing him instantly but saving the lives of his squad mates. He was 21 years old. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His action was repeated dozens of times across Iwo Jima. Marines throwing themselves on grenades. Marines charging machine gun positions. Marines advancing into certain death because their buddies were depending on them. The Japanese defenders had never encountered an enemy like this. By February 23, after 4 days of fighting that cost hundreds of Marine casualties, a 40-man patrol from Easy Company reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. At 10:20 hours, Sergeant Ernest Thomas, Sergeant Henry Hansen, Corporal Charles Lindbergh, and Private First Class James Michaels raised a small American flag on a length of pipe. Across the battlefield, Marines cheered. On ships offshore, sailors cheered. The flag on Suribachi meant that the southern end of Iwo Jima had fallen. 3 hours later, a larger flag was carried to the summit. 6 Marines raised it while combat photographer Joe Rosenthal captured what would become the most famous photograph of World War II. 3 of those 6 men would be dead within days. Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley would all be killed in the fighting that continued across the northern part of the island. The fall of Suribachi did not mean the battle was over. The fall of Suribachi meant the hard part was beginning. The northern 2/3 of Iwo Jima was a nightmare landscape of gorges, ridges, and broken volcanic rock. Kuribayashi had concentrated his main defense in 3 areas. The first was a complex of fortifications the Marines would call the meat grinder. The second was a series of ridges near Hill 362. The third was a ravine in the far north the Marines would name Bloody Gorge. Each position had been fortified over months. Each was connected by tunnels that allowed Japanese troops to move unseen. Each was defended by men who had been ordered to kill 10 Americans before dying themselves. The fighting in northern Iwo Jima was unlike anything the Marines had experienced. This was not the jungle warfare of Guadalcanal. This was not the reef assaults of Tarawa. This was cave by cave, bunker by bunker, yard by yard combat against an enemy who would not surrender and could not retreat. Marines would clear a position in the morning only to find it reoccupied by Japanese troops who had moved through the tunnels during the night. Artillery and naval gunfire that could devastate surface positions did nothing to troops 30 feet underground. Air strikes that could level a building could not reach into caves. The Marines had to go in after them. Companies from the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions advanced through terrain that offered no cover. Ridges that looked bare from a distance were actually pockmarked with spider holes where individual Japanese soldiers waited with rifles or machine guns. Ravines that seemed empty were killing zones covered by mortars pre-registered on every approach. The Marines adapted. They learned to use tanks as mobile pillboxes, positioning them to provide covering fire while infantry assaulted caves. They learned to work with flamethrower teams, burning Japanese soldiers out of positions that could not be taken with grenades alone. They learned to seal cave entrances with explosives, trapping defenders inside to suffocate. It was brutal, primitive warfare that required men to confront death at arm's length. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson of the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division, spent 4 hours on February 26 destroying Japanese positions single-handedly. Armed with a bazooka and later with a rifle, Jacobson knocked out 16 enemy positions, killed 75 Japanese soldiers, and allowed his company to advance. He was 19 years old. He received the Medal of Honor. His actions were not unique. Across Iwo Jima, young men were performing feats of courage that seemed impossible. Corporal Hushel Williams of the 21st Marines used a flamethrower for 4 hours on February 23, burning out Japanese pillboxes while under constant fire. Private First Class Jack Lucas threw himself on 2 grenades on February 20, saving 3 squad mates. He was 17 years old, the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in World War II. He survived his wounds. The casualty rates were staggering. By the end of the first week, Marine rifle companies that had landed with 250 men were down to 50 or 60 effectives. Replacements were fed into the line as fast as they arrived. Some Marines landed on Iwo Jima and were killed within hours, never having fired their weapons. By March 4, the Marines had broken through Kuribayashi's main defensive line. The general was forced to move his command post deeper into the northern highlands. That same day, at approximately 1500 hours, a damaged B-29 superfortress named Dynamite approached Iwo Jima. The bomber had been hit by anti-aircraft fire over Tokyo. It was losing fuel and altitude. First Lieutenant Raymond Mallow, the pilot, faced a choice. He could try to reach the Mariana Islands and almost certainly ditch in the ocean. He could bail out his crew over open water and hope for rescue. Or he could attempt an emergency landing on Iwo Jima's Airfield No. 1, which was still under Japanese artillery fire. Mallow chose the third option. Marines on the ground watched the silver bomber descend through light Japanese fire. It hit a telephone pole on final approach, tore off part of its landing gear, and skidded to a stop on the churned volcanic ash. The crew spent 30 minutes repairing a faulty fuel valve while Japanese troops fired at them from the northern highlands. Then Dynamite took off again and headed south toward safety. The Marines cheered. They had just seen validation for why they were dying on this worthless piece of volcanic rock. Iwo Jima would save American aircrews. Over the following months, more than 2,000 B-29s would make emergency landings on the island, saving more than 24,000 airmen. But in early March 1945, as Marines continued fighting through the meat grinder and approaching Bloody Gorge, the justification for the battle seemed hollow. The casualty reports told a story that horrified commanders and shocked the American public. By March 10, the 4th Marine Division had taken over 7,000 casualties. The 5th Marine Division had taken over 8,000. The 3rd Marine Division, committed as the Corps Reserve, had taken over 2,000. 75% of all casualties were in the infantry regiments. Rifle platoons were being ground to nothing. And the Japanese were still fighting. Kuribayashi radioed Tokyo on March 16. He reported that the battle was entering its final phase. He estimated he had 400 men still capable of fighting. He requested no reinforcements because he knew none could come. He requested no evacuation because retreat was impossible. He informed Imperial General Headquarters that he intended to lead a final attack and die with his men. Major Yoshitoka Hori, commanding the radio station on nearby Shishijima, maintained contact with Kuribayashi until the end. Hori later recalled that the general commanded his battle under candlelight, never sleeping, never resting, sustained only by the knowledge that every American casualty brought Japan one day closer to negotiated peace instead of unconditional surrender. Kuribayashi understood he could not win. He could only make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they would hesitate before invading the Japanese home islands. That calculation would prove correct, though not in the way Kuribayashi imagined. On the night of March 25, approximately 300 Japanese soldiers emerged from Bloody Gorge and infiltrated American lines. It was not a traditional banzai charge. It was a carefully planned attack targeting rear area personnel. Aviation mechanics, logistics troops, and headquarters staff found themselves fighting hand-to-hand against Japanese soldiers who had nothing left to lose. The attack caused chaos before being repulsed at dawn. More than 200 Americans were killed or wounded. The Japanese infiltrators were wiped out almost to the last man. On March 26, General Harry Schmidt declared Iwo Jima secure. Marines still fighting in the Northern Highlands questioned who the general thought he was kidding. They were still taking casualties. Japanese soldiers were still emerging from caves to fight. But strategically, Schmidt was correct. The organized Japanese defense had ended. Kuribayashi himself was killed sometime in the final days of March, though his body was never identified. He was 53 years old. He had fought for his country knowing it was doomed. He had led his men with skill and dedication. And he had written letters home that would survive him, letters expressing both his love for his family and his certainty that he would never see them again. The price paid for Iwo Jima was counted in blood and bodies. By March 26, when organized resistance ended, the Marines had suffered 6,821 killed in action. Another 19,217 were wounded. An additional 2,648 cases of combat fatigue, what later generations would call post-traumatic stress disorder, were recorded among survivors. These were the highest casualty rates the Marine Corps had experienced in its entire history. 1 in 3 Marines who landed on Iwo Jima was killed or wounded. Some units were virtually annihilated. Rifle companies that landed with 250 men finished the battle with 50. Platoons were commanded by corporals because all the officers and sergeants were dead. The 28th Marines, the regiment that took Mount Suribachi, suffered over 2,500 casualties. That was more than the regiment's entire authorized strength. The unit had to be rebuilt twice during the battle. On the Japanese side, virtually the entire garrison was destroyed. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders, only 1,083 were taken prisoner. Most of those were captured in the final days when they were too weak to resist. The rest died at their positions. They died in their caves when Marines sealed the entrances with explosives. They died in futile counterattacks that accomplished nothing except to add to the body count. They died of wounds and starvation in the tunnels, beyond the reach of anyone who might have helped them. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, the Marine commander known throughout the Pacific Fleet as Howlin' Mad Smith for his notoriously short temper, made a statement after the battle that would become legendary. By their victory, he wrote, the 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions and other units of the 5th Amphibious Corps have made an accounting to their country which only history will be able to value fully. Among the Americans serving on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. That phrase, uncommon valor was a common virtue, would be inscribed on the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. It would become the epitaph for an entire generation of Marines. But Smith said something else about Iwo Jima, something less often quoted. He called it the most savage and costly fight in the history of the Marine Corps. Smith also made a statement about Kuribayashi that revealed the degree of respect American commanders had developed for their opponent. Of all our adversaries in the Pacific, Smith said, Kuribayashi was the most redoubtable. This was extraordinary praise. Smith had fought the Japanese across the Pacific. He had commanded amphibious assaults on Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian. He had faced Japanese generals who had conquered Singapore, who had driven the British out of Burma, who had nearly driven MacArthur out of the Philippines. And yet he singled out Kuribayashi, a cavalry officer who had never commanded a major operation before Iwo Jima, as the most formidable enemy he had encountered. What made Kuribayashi redoubtable was not his tactical brilliance alone. Other Japanese commanders had been tactically competent. What set Kuribayashi apart was his understanding of his enemy. He knew the Americans. He had lived among them. He had studied their culture, their economy, their military capabilities. He knew that Japan could not win a war of attrition against American industrial might. He knew that every month Japan delayed defeat, America grew stronger while Japan grew weaker. So he designed his defense not to win, but to inflict maximum casualties, to make the Americans pay such a terrible price for Iwo Jima that they would hesitate before invading the Japanese home islands. In this calculation, Kuribayashi succeeded brilliantly. The casualty figures from Iwo Jima sent shockwaves through American military planning. If a tiny island 8 square miles in size cost nearly 7,000 Marine deaths and 27 medals of honor, the most ever awarded for a single battle, what would the invasion of Japan cost? The Japanese home islands had a population of 70 million. They had thousands of kamikazes waiting to be launched. They had millions of soldiers and millions more civilians who had been told to fight to the death. American planners began projecting casualty figures for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The estimates were staggering. Some predicted 1 million American casualties. Others predicted more. The ghosts of Iwo Jima haunted these calculations. If the Marines took 36 days and 6,821 deaths to conquer 8 square miles, how long would it take to conquer the entire Japanese homeland? How many Americans would die on the beaches of Kyushu? How many in the streets of Tokyo? These questions were answered not by invasion but by atomic bombs. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Boxcar dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. On August 15, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. The invasion of Japan never happened. One can argue about the morality of atomic warfare. One can debate whether the bombs were necessary. But one cannot deny that Iwo Jima influenced the decision. The men who planned Operation Downfall had the casualty lists from Iwo Jima on their desks. They knew what invasion would cost. And they chose a different path. Kuribayashi left behind letters that reveal much about the man and about Japanese military culture in the face of certain defeat. Before leaving for Iwo Jima, he had written to his wife, "I will always be in front of my soldiers," he promised. He kept that promise. He commanded from the front lines, not from a distant headquarters. He shared his men's hardships. He drank the same contaminated water, ate the same diminishing rations, breathed the same sulfur-laden air. As the battle approached its end, Kuribayashi wrote his final letters home. He knew he would not survive. He told his wife that not even his ashes would return home. He was correct. His body was never found. In one letter to his family, he wrote something that reveals the human being behind the general's uniform. "I am sorry to end my life here, fighting the United States of America." Kuribayashi had opposed the war from the beginning. He had told colleagues that the United States was the last country in the world that Japan should fight. He understood American power. He knew Japan could not win. And yet he fought anyway, because duty demanded it, because his emperor commanded it, because his culture gave him no alternative. This was the tragedy of Iwo Jima in miniature. Intelligent men fighting a war they knew was lost. Brave men dying for a cause that was already doomed. Soldiers on both sides killing each other for 8 square miles of volcanic rock that no one would have wanted if not for the accident of its location. Major Yoshitoka Hori was one of only 4 Japanese field-grade officers directly associated with the Battle of Iwo Jima who survived the war. He was stationed on Shishijima, 150 miles north of Iwo Jima, where he commanded the logistics and communications hub for Kuribayashi's forces. Hori maintained radio contact with Kuribayashi throughout the battle. He was the last person outside Iwo Jima to communicate with the general before the final silence. After the war, Hori wrote a memoir that was published in Japan in 1965, 20 years after the battle. It would not be translated into English until 2011, when Marine Corps veteran Charles Tatum and historian Robert Eldridge produced Fighting Spirit, the memoirs of Major Yoshitoka Hori and the Battle of Iwo Jima. Hori's account is the only detailed memoir by a Japanese officer who was intimately involved in planning the defense of Iwo Jima. In his memoirs, Hori wrote about the Marines with a mixture of professional respect and personal anguish. He described watching through binoculars as the American landing craft approached the beaches on February 19. He knew what awaited them. He knew the carefully prepared killing zones, the pre-registered artillery, the interlocking fields of fire. He also knew that despite all these preparations, the Americans would keep coming. Hori wrote about the quality of Marine leadership at all levels. He noted that when American officers were killed, enlisted men immediately assumed command. When those men were killed, others stepped forward. The chain of command never broke because the Marines fought as individuals when necessary and as units when possible. They were flexible in a way Japanese forces were not. Japanese military doctrine emphasized obedience to orders. Initiative at lower ranks was discouraged. Soldiers were expected to follow the plan, even when the plan was failing. American Marines operated differently. They were expected to accomplish objectives using whatever means necessary. If the plan did not work, they improvised. If one approach failed, they tried another. This adaptability, Hori wrote, was what made them so difficult to defeat. You could kill American Marines. You could destroy their units. But you could not make them stop trying. If you found this exploration of historical perspectives meaningful, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell so you never miss these stories that deserve to be remembered. Hori also wrote about American material superiority. The Marines who landed on Iwo Jima were supported by a logistical system that seemed almost magical to Japanese observers. Within hours of the landing, the Americans had established supply dumps on the beach. Within days, they had brought tanks, artillery, and bulldozers ashore. By the end of the first week, they had constructed roads, established field hospitals, and built ammunition depots. The Japanese garrison, by contrast, was cut off from all resupply from the moment the battle began. They fought with what they had brought to the island months earlier. When ammunition ran out, positions fell silent. When food ran out, men starved. When medical supplies ran out, the wounded died untreated in the caves. Hori described the final radio messages from Iwo Jima with a grief that is palpable even in translation. Kuribayashi's last confirmed transmission came on March 23. He reported that he had fewer than 400 men still capable of fighting. He stated that he would lead a final attack that night. He expected to die in that attack. Then the transmissions stopped. Hori waited by the radio for 3 days, hoping to hear something, anything, from Iwo Jima. There was only silence. In his memoir, Hori reflected on what the battle revealed about Japanese and American approaches to warfare. The Japanese, he wrote, fought with courage that came from centuries of samurai tradition. They accepted death as honorable. They sought glory in sacrifice. But this cultural strength had become a strategic weakness. When courage alone is not enough to win a battle, what do? The Americans, Hori observed, fought with a different kind of courage. They did not seek death. They sought victory. They were willing to die if necessary, but they preferred to live and keep fighting. This practical approach to courage in service of winning rather than dying, gave them an advantage that Japanese military culture could not match. Hori also noted the Americans' treatment of prisoners. Japanese soldiers had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. They had been told that Americans would torture and kill prisoners. When Japanese soldiers were finally captured on Iwo Jima, they discovered this was a lie. American Marines gave captured Japanese soldiers food, water, and medical treatment. Some Japanese prisoners were so shocked by this humane treatment that they wept. Hori wrote that this revealed something important about American character. The Americans fought ferociously, but they did not fight with hatred. They killed when necessary, but they did not dehumanize their enemies. This was a concept Japanese military culture had difficulty comprehending. The aftermath of Iwo Jima had effects that reached far beyond the 8 square miles of volcanic rock where the battle was fought. In Japan, the loss of Iwo Jima was a psychological shock. The island was technically part of the Tokyo prefecture. Its fall meant that American forces had captured Japanese sovereign territory for the first time in the war. The home islands were now within range of American bombers flying from Iwo Jima's captured airfields. The Japanese government had assured its people that the homeland would never be invaded. Iwo Jima's fall made that assurance a lie. In the United States, the casualty lists from Iwo Jima provoked a public outcry. Newspapers published photographs of the wounded. Radio broadcasts described the brutal fighting. American mothers who had already sacrificed sons in Europe now learned that the Pacific War was far from over. The strategic value of Iwo Jima was questioned. Was this volcanic rock really worth 6,821 American lives? The answer, military planners insisted, was yes. Within months of its capture, Iwo Jima's airfields were hosting emergency landings by damaged B-29s returning from bombing raids over Japan. By the end of the war, more than 2,400 emergency landings had been recorded. Those landings saved approximately 24,000 American aircrews. If Iwo Jima saved 24,000 lives at a cost of 6,821, the arithmetic was brutal but clear. The island was worth the price. But the deeper legacy of Iwo Jima was not mathematical. It was psychological. The battle revealed to both sides what total war meant. It meant fighting until nothing remained to fight with. It meant casualties that shocked even veterans of previous campaigns. It meant a level of violence that exceeded anything in the Pacific War up to that point. The Japanese learned that American fighting men would not stop. No matter how many casualties they took, no matter how brutal the fighting became, the Marines would keep advancing. This realization influenced Japanese planning for the defense of Okinawa, the next major battle, which would become even bloodier than Iwo Jima. The Americans learned that Japanese soldiers would not surrender. No matter how hopeless their situation, no matter how certain their defeat, Japanese defenders would fight to the death. This realization influenced American planning for the invasion of Japan, an invasion that would have been catastrophic for both sides. The atomic bombs that ended the war before that invasion could begin were, in a very real sense, a legacy of Iwo Jima. The men who made the decision to use those weapons had the casualty lists from Iwo Jima in front of them. They knew what conventional invasion of Japan would cost. And they chose atomic warfare as the lesser evil. The Marines who survived Iwo Jima carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Many could not speak about what they had experienced. The memories were too raw, too painful, too saturated with the blood of friends. Years later, decades later, some would return to Iwo Jima. They would walk the beaches where they had landed. They would climb Mount Suribachi where the flag had been raised. They would stand in silence at the cemeteries where their comrades were buried. Japanese survivors had their own pilgrimage to make. A few hundred Japanese soldiers had survived by hiding in the caves, some for months after the battle officially ended. These men eventually surrendered or were captured. They returned to Japan bearing shame for having survived when duty demanded death. It took years, sometimes decades, for them to speak about their experiences. When they did, their accounts revealed the same themes that appeared in Hori's memoir. Respect for their Marine opponents. Acknowledgement that Japan had been defeated by an enemy with superior resources and an unconquerable will. Recognition that the war had been futile from the beginning. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the battle, a reunion was held on Iwo Jima. American veterans and Japanese veterans met on the beaches where they had tried to kill each other 40 years earlier. They shook hands. They embraced. They wept together. The ceremonies included prayers for the dead of both nations. American Marines laid wreaths at Japanese memorials. Japanese veterans laid wreaths at American memorials. The hatred that had driven them to kill each other had long since faded. What remained was a shared understanding that they had all been young men caught in forces beyond their control, fighting for causes they did not fully understand, dying for objectives that seemed less important as the decades passed. One Marine veteran was asked by a reporter what he felt standing on Iwo Jima again after 40 years. The veteran looked at the black volcanic sand, the same sand that had swallowed his friends. He looked at Mount Suribachi, where the flag still flew. He looked at the Japanese veterans standing nearby, old men now, no longer enemies. Just a lot of sadness, he said. Just a lot of sadness for all the young men who never got the chance to grow old. The strategic debate about Iwo Jima continued long after the war ended. Some historians argued that the island was unnecessary. Japan's air force had already been crippled by losses elsewhere. The B-29s could have continued bombing Japan from the Marianas. The emergency landing facilities were valuable but not essential. The battle was a waste of lives for an objective that did not significantly shorten the war. Other historians disagreed. The emergency landing facilities saved thousands of American aircrew lives. The capture of Iwo Jima demonstrated to Japan that American forces could seize and hold Japanese territory. The battle's psychological impact on Japanese military planning for the defense of the home islands was significant. The battle was costly but necessary. This debate, like all strategic debates about war, has no definitive answer. War is not mathematics. The value of an objective cannot be calculated with precision. Human lives cannot be weighed on a scale. The question of whether Iwo Jima was worth the cost depends on assumptions about what might have happened if the battle had not been fought. And those assumptions can never be proven. What can be stated without debate is that the men who fought on Iwo Jima demonstrated courage that still inspires generations later. They fought in conditions that would break most human beings. They watched friends die. They themselves faced death daily. They kept fighting because others depended on them, because their nation had sent them, because duty demanded it. This was true for Marines and for Japanese soldiers alike. The color of the uniform did not change the fundamental human reality. These were young men, most barely out of their teens, thrust into a nightmare not of their making, asked to do things no human should have to do. And they did them. The Japanese generals who survived World War II and later wrote about their experiences consistently noted certain qualities in American fighting men. They noted American material superiority, the endless supplies, the constant replacement of casualties, the overwhelming firepower. But they also noted something else. They noted that American soldiers fought not just with weapons but with an idea. The idea was that individual human beings matter, that every life has value, that courage is not about seeking death but about risking death for something worth living for. This was a radically different philosophy from the Japanese military culture of the 1940s. That culture emphasized the collective over the individual. It taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor. It demanded sacrifice without questioning whether that sacrifice served any useful purpose. American military culture, by contrast, was rooted in a democratic tradition that valued individual initiative. American soldiers were expected to think for themselves when circumstances required it. They were trained to accomplish objectives, not simply to follow orders. They fought to win and go home, not to die gloriously on some foreign beach. These different philosophies produced different tactical behaviors. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima fought from fixed positions. They followed Kuribayashi's plan to perfection. They killed many Marines. But when their positions were overrun, they died. American Marines faced with similar circumstances would fall back, reorganize, and attack again from a different direction. They would call in naval gunfire or air support. They would bring up flamethrowers or demolitions. They would find a way to accomplish the objective. This flexibility, this willingness to adapt when plans failed, was what made them so difficult to defeat. Kuribayashi understood this. His letters and the accounts from Hori make clear that the Japanese general recognized American adaptability as a weapon as dangerous as American firepower. He designed his defense to minimize the Americans' tactical advantages. He banned banzai charges that would waste his men's lives. He created defensive positions that were mutually supporting so that the destruction of one position did not doom the others. He stretched the battle out as long as possible to maximize American casualties. In purely military terms, Kuribayashi's defense of Iwo Jima was brilliant. He accomplished exactly what he set out to do. He made the Americans pay a terrible price for every yard of ground. He held out for 36 days against overwhelming force. He killed or wounded more than a third of the Marines who landed on the island. And yet he lost. The island was taken. His men were destroyed. The strategic objective he was defending was captured and turned against Japan. All his skill and courage and tactical brilliance could not change the fundamental reality. Japan could not win a war of attrition against the United States. The industrial base was too unequal. The resource disparity was too great. American ability to replace losses and continue fighting was something no amount of Japanese courage could overcome. The final truth about Iwo Jima is that it was a battle that should never have been fought. If Japan had not started a war it could not win, those 28,000 deaths, American and Japanese combined, would never have occurred. If militarism had not dominated Japanese politics in the 1930s, the Pacific War would never have begun. If the United States had been willing to accept a negotiated peace instead of demanding unconditional surrender, the invasion of Iwo Jima might have been unnecessary. These are the historical counterfactuals that haunt every war. The paths not taken. The decisions that might have led to different outcomes. The young men who might have lived if leaders had chosen differently. But history is not written in the subjunctive mood. What happened, happened. The Marines landed on Iwo Jima. The Japanese defended it. Thousands died. The island was captured. The war continued until atomic bombs ended it. These are facts. What the Japanese generals wrote about American Marines after Iwo Jima was also a fact. They wrote with respect. They wrote with a recognition that they had faced an enemy who was not just better equipped but different in fundamental ways. An enemy who fought to win, not to die. An enemy who adapted instead of rigidly following plans. An enemy who valued individual initiative over collective obedience. These qualities, more than American industrial might, more than superior firepower, were what made American forces so formidable. The legacy of Iwo Jima lives on in the Marine Corps today. Every Marine recruit learns about the battle. Every Marine knows the names. John Basilwan, who won the Medal of Honor at Guadalcanal and died on Iwo Jima. Herschel Williams with his flamethrower. Jack Lucas throwing himself on grenades at age 17. The 6 men raising the flag on Suribachi. These stories are told and retold because they matter. They represent something essential about the Marine Corps identity. Courage under fire. Refusal to accept defeat. Willingness to sacrifice for fellow Marines. These values did not originate on Iwo Jima, but they were tested there in ways they had never been tested before. And they proved adequate to the test. The Marines took the island. They paid a terrible price, but they took it. This is what the Marines do. This is what they have always done. This is what those Japanese generals recognized and wrote about with such respect. If this story has moved you, if these accounts of courage and sacrifice from both sides have resonated, please take a final moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. These stories matter. The men who fought deserve to be remembered, not as abstractions or statistics, but as human beings who faced unimaginable horror and somehow found the strength to keep going. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping their memory alive.